I'm not sure how I got subtitles on the bottom here. I'll figure that out later, but just ignore that for right now, if you don't mind. Good morning. I'm Jim Florwick. And I am really quite honored to be here, man. I told somebody when I came in this morning, there's not many rooms that intimidate me. This is one. So let's talk about high density. Anybody in here ever get a large public venue? Think, oh yay, and then immediately start to wake up at 2 in the morning with a long list of things that make you cry? Okay. That's how I got into it, and it wasn't easy when we did it. We failed a lot, and we're just dumb enough to keep showing up. So you've gotten all your SSIDs trimmed down, you've got your data rates right, you got your power right, you put your APs everywhere you could think of, and if you looked out in the hallway and saw all these people and were expecting them, good deal. If you were not, surprise. It's not a problem when people get on your network. It's when they all get on your network that you have a problem, right? So this is high client density, which is a different problem because I hear people all the time say, oh yeah, we're high density in the office. I know, I see 2 users per AP. And you can walk on the APs to get to the bathroom, right? So everybody's high density, but do they need it? There's 3 relationships we're designing for. 1, AP to the client. That's how well can you hear the AP, right? And that signal to noise ratio is one aspect of it. And then the client to the AP, which the client to the AP tends to be pretty standardized. I mean, we've got, anybody ever, the AFC power that we can get, you're not getting it out of a client device yet. So the client device, from a transmit standpoint, stays fairly consistent. We've all got our favorites. And then there's the AP to the AP connection. And what's different about these is the client to the AP connection enjoys the MRC of the AP. It enjoys 2 more spatial streams in most cases than the client device does. So it already has better receiving. That client on the ground, on the other hand, between the AP to the client, it's sitting right there with all of you guys, right? And it is surrounded by a sea of attenuation. So it does not have the same privilege to hear everything in the room that you do at the ceiling. So when they came out in LPI and said, hey, we're going to have a 6 dB default, I was like, that's fine. But I know we can start a religious argument in here with asynchronous versus synchronous power budgets going to the ceiling. Suffice it to say, I always have a better receiver on the ceiling. And then I was watching the presentations yesterday and I noticed everybody was doing Wi-Fi 7 testing, and I just did some before Christmas, and I did some because, when you get that question when a new standard comes out, it's like, oh, with all the error correction and all the cool things that it has, do we even care about where we put APs anymore? I promise you I get it every single standard. So I went and tested because I figured somebody was going to ask this question, and sure enough, they did. And the test bed we set up was just real simple. I was proud I was able to get almost 3 gigabits out of my test bed. I've got 10 gig in there now, but we had 3 1-gig chariots to do this with. So we set up 2 APs, 50 feet apart, put a wall in between them, 2 groups of clients. I spaced the clients out so that they wouldn't be interfering with each other. They would really be on the dedicated cell. And we just did some channel combination testing. My basic run through was getting me 2.8 gig on 2 groups of 10 on 2 separate APs on separate channels. 160 megahertz wide on 6 gig, 40 megahertz wide on 5 gig. And we were testing MLO, really. The next thing we did was put the 2 primary channels together on 5 gigahertz. And what you see is, and it was repeatable, we got a hit on the latency, not too much on the throughput. So you probably wouldn't have noticed a whole heck of a lot unless you were really being particular about it. But it ran just fine without a hitch. And then we separated those primaries and see what happened to the latency? Now it's a free-for-all, it's contention-based, right? So that's when the latency really starts to go, and the throughput took a pretty good hit there as well, and that's just a coordination at the MAC layer. If I go down to 6 gigahertz and I put both of their primaries on the same, I'm still holding that latency, I'm losing some more throughput, actually got a little bit back I think, didn't I? Yeah, I got a little bit back. And then when I separated the primaries on that 6 gigahertz, everything kind of went wonky. And this is interesting. We got to go back and look at it because overlapping secondary OBSS for the secondary 40s or 80s are supposed to be kind of an okay thing. It didn't look too okay to me. But it was also full buffer traffic. So the answer is, yeah, it still matters. And if you get into a high density environment where you've got a lot of APs and a lot of people, it's going to matter even more. And that's really what this is about. So antennas, I love antennas. As soon as you say antennas, anybody in this room think, oh God, I don't want to get with antennas. That starts to get complicated, expensive, and you're right on all those things. But you're also talking about doing a convention center or a major league sporting event. They have ways to deal with complication and expense, and that's what it's going to take to do it. The density of the clients being served, there's no place out there to isolate a cell. And I remember when we first started doing this, I jumped into large public venues just because nobody could download email in the room. I was telling them how wonderful our Wi-Fi was, and I'm dumb that way, so we fixed it. But when we did that, everybody needed it to be in 2.4 gigahertz, which you know the math is not going to favor. And the protocols weren't there yet. And right about the same time, a guy I was hoping to have here today, Matt Schwartz, says, I think we can do it in a stadium. And my first thought was huge parabolic reflector filled with radios. What could go wrong? So, the point is, neither one of us were done with our careers yet. And what we learned was placement is king. If you get the placement right, everything else flows from that, and that's what this is going to talk about. Now, I'm not doing on product. I've got our products. I know the best. But any antenna out there, a good antenna, should have a good sharp side lobe on it, and you can isolate cells in the middle of the air with antennas. And we've got a couple of options, usually 60 or 70 by 70 degrees. If you've got good side lobes on it, it's going to give you up to about 10 meters. And it starts to get big at 10 meters, but you can control crowds and do things with that you're not going to be able to do with an Omni. A couple of miles of that, I've got some wide beams. They're useful for walkways, fronts of lecture halls. You can take out the first 5 or 6 rows with an antenna down in front. And then we've got the one that I'm going to talk about the most today is the integrated antenna, because this one just did, and I brought results from Cisco Live just last week that were just unbelievable to me in a high-density environment and indicative of how much better the technology, the radios, and all the work that everybody here has been doing has made this technology, because it's impressive now in a high-dense environment. Large public venues come with a lot of challenges. Stadiums, arenas, convention centers, theaters. One thing I will tell you, you know how your customer likes to believe that every building's the same, so we did one building, now we just do that another 250 times across the globe and it'll all be fine, right? Stadiums are very, very much bid out by architects, and they're unique, and they become a centerpiece in the community. So you're not going to find two that are the same. They're typically maybe built along the same lines of architecture, but they all have their pet peeves, and they all have where you can and can't. And you'd better know where you can and can't mount things. And you're going to expect to have some conversations about it. Giving you an idea of where we were just in 2020, and this was right before COVID, I had 122 interfaces in a room with about 7,000 people. Reusing the channel plan 6.4 times in this one, and it is a wide open room too. And we were able to, with the Graylings, the 30 by 30 antennas, isolate that and get good performance out of it. But again, distance is going to be the real killer. And even then, with those antennas, I wasn't going over 70. And I wasn't going over 70 feet. Before they built this antenna, engineering said, Jim, how far will you go with that? I said, 70 feet. Well, why you only go 70 feet? I said, because Matt Schwartz said, don't go over 70 feet. He said, what happens if you go over 70 feet? You'll have to ask Matt. I don't do dumb things, right? He said, don't, I don't. So we built this on purpose to solve that problem, and we got quite a bit. We built it as an integrated unit, and And we did that for a couple of reasons to make it flexible. The other problem that we had is all these fixed aperture antennas. Every time you get a ceiling height change, you're really changing the quality of the coverage unless you match that with a new aperture or you do something to offset that. So trying to reduce variability means if I had the configurability in an antenna to change these things, I would use it. So deployment flexibility, integrated unit means quick hang. We looked at things we were doing, putting stuff on rails at a Cisco live show. I've got pictures. I'm not proud of them. I'm really good with the tie wrap. This stuff was ugly. Okay? We covered it with black bags so nobody would see it. So it's come quite a way. One of the things this antenna does that's unique and what gives me so much power with it is it's two 25 by 25 degree arrays that I have the ability to software steer. And that makes all the difference because I can configure that antenna for different ceiling heights, different coverage models. I've even got this in places where I go wide at night and shut off 3/4 of the APs to spare their power budget, right? So it gives me a lot of flexibility. It's built for outdoors. That way I don't have to worry about whether I got an enclosure or conduit or anything like that going to it. I can just hang it wherever I need to. And does it work? Yeah, we've been real happy with it. It turns out just last fall they were out in San Jose and they tested this on a range, and I got Derek and Naveed and all the guys that did some really good work out there. Johannes Jobs was out there collecting this, if you know JJ. 200 feet, 21 feet high, 10-degree down tilt. And this is a look at the low and the high radio, both on bore site and out at 200 feet, plenty of signal out there, plenty of throughput. This is steered, so this is left and right steered. So that takes that panel 20 degrees off of bore site, either direction, and you can absolutely steer these beams. And think about this, if you had like a stadium with an inclining stairway, if you put that into portrait mode, you can actually angle those beams differently so that you can match the stadium rise. It helps out quite a bit. And then, I didn't put the animation in. This is the downside. This antenna was so sharp on the edge that in this hall, and I can't move that right now. If you look at the top, all the gaps that I had in the coverage out near the edges, that was because the antennas were too far apart. And it was really subtle, and it looked like good coverage when you walk through it with your device. And then I went over to where these nulls were, and if I stepped 1 meter to the left, I lost 6 dB. And when I stepped another meter to the left, I picked the 6 dB back up. So needless to say, we went in and replaced those antennas into different locations. It was very sharp. And it means you have to know what you're doing with an antenna, or you can get some very bad unintended results quickly with it. And if you take a look at the relief that I put on the front, that's from I just walked that last week. But if you take a look at the ISOs, those are 1 dB. And those green dots are 8 feet apart. So, it comes with a huge checklist. One of the ways we isolated this was the low band and high band 5 gigahertz radios. They're band locked. One of the other things about this is that antenna is so sharp, we got worried that you wouldn't be able to hear network discovery protocol and therefore locked out RRM on it, which surprised a lot of people. If you think it's hard to put antennas into place, tell them now they have to take 200 APs in a room and give it a manual channel plan. Now, I know half of you are like, when do we start? And the other half is like, oh, God. So there were some downsides to it. But if you knew what you were doing and you had the abilities to go out and plan something like this, and actually the negotiation with the customer in these things is oftentimes 3/4 of your battle. You get it put in, it'll work like a champ. Now, what about 6 gigahertz? Man, that is good 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. 6 gigahertz, yeah, it's coming, but let's just talk about that elephant in the room. This is where I was 2 weeks before Cisco Live, and this is where we did a lot of our antenna testing. This is Claire Audio up in Pennsylvania, great guys. But they have this huge 200 foot by 250 foot by 70 foot tall building, 75 foot tall I can get the rails up to. And it has a huge advantage right now. In Pennsylvania, this is 75 degrees inside all day long and no wind. It's a wonderful place to go do some antenna testing. Any rate, stay tuned. 6 gigahertz. Oh, what about that? Well, around the world, if you're doing any deployments that aren't just in the US or if you're coming out of ETSI, it's a very different specification, right? In the US, we've got AFC. How many of you have played with AFC yet? All right, we've got that for us in Canada, and it's a way forward. What I'll tell you is, it's more complexity. It definitely is. And you're going to get involved with GPSs and GNSSs because it becomes life. That error correction or that ability to resolve your distance and your location becomes very, very incidental to what you're going to get for power. And we've learned some things. But I will say this, I'm really happy I don't need it in ETSI. And the key difference on why you do or won't need it or where you will need it comes right down to the PSDs. In the US, we got that 5 dB per megahertz, which is great. I mean, I thought that was super. With bonding channels, I get more signal, which means I'm going to maintain signal to noise ratio. It's all good. What I hadn't realized, and what a lot of folks hadn't, how many of you surveyed that? Go out and look at a 20 megahertz channel, then a 160 megahertz channel. And if you did, you called me pretty soon after that and said, what the heck? I don't see no 30 dB there. It's the same size. And it is because I have the ability to get all the way up to 30 dBm in a 320 megahertz channel, but for any given 20 megahertz channel, i.e. my management and all of my beacons, I am locked in 20 megahertz forever, which means my cell admission is 18 dBm EIRP in the United States. And I have got ceilings that are not going to make that a happy thing. Now the floor is going to get too far away. So there's a debate. We're waiting. Right now with the signal to noise ratio or the noise that's in a convention center, when we brought up 6 gigahertz, noise floor has been plenty low, not having a problem at all. I don't expect 6 gigahertz is going to stay empty and noise free for as long as we hope it will. I remember when 5 gigahertz had nothing in it. Yeah, I'm that old. So we need AFC, like it or not, and that becomes, and I thought I'd throw that in there because not a lot of people understand what you're going to get. You're like, hey, no problem, we'll get up to 30 megahertz, but you won't. you need to hear that beacon and get on it. So placement becomes the next challenge. And that always runs into, boy, anybody ever go to a really old university and talk to them about where you can put APs? Inside of a wall. We cannot mess with the mahogany that's on the fascias. Yeah, I understand. But you want wireless, and that's kind of a new thing. Well, you know, I got over this years ago. I was in a convention center, and I walked the 6 guys that were important through that convention center, and we just stopped at every place they said I couldn't put an AP and said, okay, so no Wi-Fi right here. We can't have no Wi-Fi. Well, I can't make it without a radio. And we worked it out. So placement becomes critical. In here, overhead, I like antennas a lot because it makes things so much better. And if you think it's going to be cheaper to go under seat, you're wrong. Now you got conduit boxes, everything else going, and you're going to need more radios than you do overhead. You will actually do better overhead than you will underneath. Now, in most cases, you're going to have a combination of both. You get into a large stadium, they've got large overheads, and they are way too far away from the seats, or they don't go out far enough. So you learn things in this, like shooting from behind down the stairs is not a good idea because the guy in front stands up, he's out of your coverage zone. Playing with it in your environment, but it has gotten easier. The capacity of these radios now is unbelievable. Everybody's clients are better. I don't worry about failing as much. I've seen it recently. It wasn't my network, and it still is horrifying to watch duty cycle go through the roof and know that there's not a thing you can do except get them people out of the room. That's a long keynote. So we'll put 2 in on either side. Typically what you'll find with these classrooms and auditoriums in a convention is that they're grouped inside of one hall, so you've got multiples of these to worry about. Just look at it from overhead and make sure you're not pointing your antennas into each other. And then you get into the larger areas where you've got high ceilings, and this is actually from what we call the World of Solutions at one of our events, and it is filled with everything that radiates known to man. It is what we lovingly call the RF bazooka. And one year, we had the forethought to put the meeting village right at the end of this hall through a concrete conduit that looks just like a waveguide and fired straight into that meeting village. And they couldn't get any connectivity through the center of that meeting village. And we went down there and looked at it, and I thought, boy, I bet that looked good in planning. So we still have our challenges. Underseat versus overhead. How many of you have done both? When you're underseat, the thing I don't like about underseat, and believe me, that's where I started and finally got some relief from having all those meetings that come with failing. Underseat, it's a lumpier cell, the response across the cell, and it has to be because you're putting it down in with the attenuation. So as you move 3 feet away from that AP, you have a whole different condition than you did in the previous 3 feet, and it erodes much faster than it does over the head. And you also have the reverse playing true. All of the client signals are also being attenuated, and not at the same rate because they're not starting at the same power. So it gets a little bit dicier. The other thing I will tell you is co-channel is definitely a problem to handle in an underseat model. Anybody ever do a large venue and look at it when it's empty and think, oh God, I've got to tune everything down? Don't. Do it. When it fills up, it's a different place. And why directional antennas? How many of you ever seen the AP in the room that had every client and all the other APs were just hoping for some business and you were hoping they got some? All right, you can do a lot with the protocols, but you can't work pure magic. It's still physics and there's still math involved. And if you don't isolate them and give a client a reason to shift, it won't. And I realized this years ago. We walked in the room, we had a bunch of APs in. I think it was a large event in San Francisco. And the AP at the door still had 140 clients on it. And the APs in the middle had onesies, twosies, right? So we started to play around with that, and that's really where we started to look at it hard. Antenna selection and placement. Overhead, I can't say it enough. I've been happy every time we get it. Everybody always says, oh, the antenna's so big, take a look at it at 100 feet. It's not. It's also dark, and the only people in the world that look up when they walk in a building are sitting in this room, right? No one ever looks. And we're all like, oh man, that's 900 megahertz over there. That's So, favor overhead placement. It's going to get you closer to the client. It's going to give you a better experience all the way around. You're going to get more repeatable results across the cell. It's going to be more even. Clear line of sight. Again, you've got to calculate in that density coming from the AP. I've got power, I've got spatial streams. I can do a lot from the AP with things that are in the room. But from the client device, it starts with a poor antenna, and it may be in your pocket, right? So it's already got things to work on in life. If you make them go through a whole bunch of people, it just gets worse. Consider AP placement and client distance from the AP, not just the distance from the AP to the floor, but the actual distance in the intended coverage cell. Now, what can you do with it once you've got the genie out of the bottle? Limit the number of SSIDs. Anybody ever have that conversation with a customer? Is it just me, or is the SSID a religious object in most organizations? You can't talk people off of an SSID to save their lives. They had it named after them, right? So when you walk in and you see 15 SSIDs because 16 simply won't be supported, you know you got a problem on your hand, but each one of those comes with its own management traffic. It has to beacon, it has to access, and I'll tell you where this really comes to play. When you're looking at the SSIDs, we had a night, and this was back in the day, we were failing pretty regularly at this point, and wondering if we were able to make good career decisions. We got a stadium to shut off all of the 2.4 gigahertz coverage in the stadium right after the game, and when they did, we saw 40% channel utilization. And we had been watching through the whole game with a spec in these 5 megahertz regular blips that were just present through the entire game. It was probes. It was probing. It was probing clients that drove 40% channel utilization in 2.4 gigahertz. And after that, we got real, and we still didn't identify what was in the spectrum until like 2 days later when Matt called me and said, take a look at the 11 channels that are in 2.4 gigahertz. They're on 5 megahertz boundaries. That was the 20 megahertz channels as it was going through all 11 for every device in that stadium that just got disconnected. So it's important. These things add up. The other thing you will find is they didn't call you to come in and do this stadium's Wi-Fi because it works so well, did they? And if it's not working well, what do people do? They find a way to the internet and they put in APs, and you have to be aware of those because they will rob you of a happy experience. Data rates. Got to keep data rates up. When you're making small cells, that AP is a finite amount of capacity, and it only provides so much. You've got to be able to move people around to those cells, and higher data rates is the key when you start getting APs closer together. So I've heard a lot of controversy. People say, oh, you can't use 36, do it all day long. And I remember, in fact, the first time we were successful was 2012, and I had gotten literally everything we needed to do the stadium, and yet still at 2 a.m. I was on the phone with my wife from London, and she said, but what are you worried about? And I said, well, if it doesn't work tomorrow, we just don't know what we're doing. That's a career change moment. It did work. But I called Matt Schwartz and I said, 24 or 36? He said, that is the question. Go too high, you're going to have a problem. Go too low, you're going to have more problems. So you got to get it right, and you're not going to be able to get 8,000 people to come sit in your seat and play with the Wi-Fi just so that you can dial it in. So there's a few moments. Maximizing the spectrum includes, how hard is it to get on a Wi-Fi network? When they're not on your network, they're probing. And when they're probing, they're chewing up airtime and they're limiting the access to the channel. So you want to make it easy for people to get on the network. Captive portal, if you've got it, grab them up right away, because a client that's looking for a Wi-Fi network is going to chew up precious resources. Unlimited, or limit the unnecessary traffic over the air. Take a look deep inside your infrastructure. Things we do for convenience can really cost you airtime when you need every single tick of it. And then eliminating unnecessary traffic over the air can have big results. If you take a look at the channel utilization before and after, now you're getting in the range you need to be. So does it work? That's the big question. This is the keynote from Amsterdam. And by the way, we built that antenna and we had it coming into production just before COVID, and we shut down the entire world. So it was 2.5 years before I got to see that antenna in a real event. And this was the first real event that we saw. And that's the architecture on the left-hand side where we've got the APs placed in the overhead. And we are very much using the software steering. At the outer edges, it's wider. Inner, it's narrow. And then there's a density map on the right of where the clients were positioned in there. And not all the clients were being tracked. This is voluntary in Europe. But I got a fair semblance of what was on the ground underneath of it. And what was unique, for the first time, I saw almost 90% Wi-Fi 6 only. We had no 802.11n in the venue. The worst and oldest was Wi-Fi 5, which was actually a really tolerable protocol. And then that little chunk up there of Wi-Fi 7. On the floor, I get telemetry from the clients, and I'll read that for you since it's small. That's minus 56 dBm with 36 dB of SNR. And that's the first one I grabbed. I've never seen over 35 SNR in a keynote in my life. And then it just kept stacking up. This one's 40 dB, 45 dB, 47 dB. That is amazing in the middle of a room with 8,000 of your closest friends. How do we do on load balancing? You can take a look at this later. But across the top is slot 1 and slot 2. And there's some outliers in there, but for the most part, it was fairly balanced. And then the channel utilization in that room hung at about 60. And I didn't put the last slide in here because I was getting worried about time. But that utilization around the world, we've got a couple of venues that I get into yearly. And what's been really satisfying is watching the protocols go, watching how much we're taking off the air now. I mean, we're like terabytes over the course of a couple, 3 days. But watching that data that we're pulling out of a venue double and triple and looking at the speeds that you're getting on the ground, double and triple, and watching that channel utilization, which is the measure of that resource, hang right at 60 or 65% says we're doing things right. So don't be afraid to jump into it. If you do, definitely hold your ground and get what you need to do the job, because at the end of the day, it's a lot of meetings if you don't. And that's all I had for you this morning. Thank you very much.